Against all odds, how one black U.S. Marine's medical innovation saved hundreds of lives on the battlefield. The weight of two battles. The year was 1950, and for James Richardson, the weight of two battles pressed down on him with crushing force. One was the war unfolding on the frigid Korean peninsula, a conflict far from the sweltering heat of his native Alabama. The other, an older, more insidious war, was fought daily on the home front, the battle against racial prejudice and segregation, a fight he had known since birth. James grew up in a small, dusty town in Alabama, where the lines of segregation were etched as deeply into the earth as they were into the hearts of men. His grandmother, a woman of fierce spirit and quiet dignity, had instilled in him a profound sense of purpose. James, she'd often say, her voice a soft melody against the harsh realities of their lives, God gave you a mind for healing. Don't let no man, black or white, tell you what you can't do with it. From a young age, James had dreamed of becoming a doctor. He devoured every medical text he could lay his hands on, his agile mind absorbing the intricacies of anatomy and physiology with an almost spiritual fervor. He saw healing not just as a profession, but as a calling, a sacred duty to alleviate suffering. Yet the path to medical school for a young black man in the pre-civil rights South was less a path and more an insurmountable wall. Faced with limited opportunities, James sought another route to fulfill his calling. The military, despite its own entrenched racial biases, offered a chance for training and service that civilian life often denied. He enlisted in the Marine Corps, not as a rifleman, but as a corpsman, a medic. His family, though proud, harbored deep fears. The Marines ain't no place for colored folk, James, his uncle Silas had warned, his eyes heavy with the burden of generations of injustice. They'll work you harder, treat you worse, and still not look you in the eye. But James, with the quiet resolve that was his hallmark, believed he could make a difference, even within a system designed to hold him back. His training was a brutal crucible. The physical demands were immense, but the psychological toll of racism was often more draining. He endured slurs and dismissive remarks from some of his white counterparts and even a few non-commissioned officers. He was often assigned the most menial tasks, made to clean latrines or swab decks while others studied advanced medical procedures. Yet James never faltered. He learned faster, worked harder, and proved himself indispensable, not just with his medical knowledge, but with his unflappable calm under pressure. He meticulously absorbed every lesson, knowing that one day, lives would depend on his hands, regardless of the color of his skin. The journey to Korea was long and fraught with apprehension. The Incheon landing was a baptism by fire, a chaotic maelstrom of gunfire, explosions, and the screams of the wounded. James, thrust into the thick of it, found himself applying tourniquets, bandaging wounds, and administering morphine amidst the deafening roar of battle. The sheer scale of suffering was overwhelming, a stark contrast to the sterile diagrams in his textbooks. Here, life was fragile, flickering out in an instant, and his purpose became brutally clear: to cling to every flicker, to fight for every breath. One evening, huddled in a makeshift aid station, the constant thump of distant artillery providing a grim percussion, James remembered a story his grandmother used to tell him from the Bible. He had been tending to a young Marine whose leg had been shattered by shrapnel, his face pale with shock and blood loss. The boy, barely out of high school, looked up at James with wide, terrified eyes. James thought of the story of the Good Samaritan. He recalled his grandmother's words, and Jesus answered and said, "A certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and fell among thieves, which stripped him of his raiment and wounded him, and departed, leaving him half dead. And by chance there came down a certain priest that way, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. But a certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, came where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion on him, and went to him, and bound up his wounds, pouring in oil and wine, and set him on his own beast, and brought him to an inn, and took care of him." It wasn't about who you were, or where you came from, or the color of your skin. It was about seeing suffering, and having the compassion to act, to do whatever was necessary to heal. James understood then that his duty wasn't just to the core, but to the humanity within each fallen man. In the face of death, every life was precious, every breath a victory. The war in Korea was a battle for survival, but for James, it was also a test of his deepest convictions, a proving ground where the weight of his personal battle against prejudice would ultimately meet the stark equalizing reality of combat. The biting wind howled through the jagged peaks surrounding the Chosin Reservoir, carrying with it the scent of ice, fear, and cordite. It was late 1950, and the brutal Korean winter had descended with a vengeance, turning the mountainous terrain into a frozen hell. Corporal James Richardson's unit, part of the 1st Marine Division, found themselves caught in a relentless, unforgiving battle against overwhelming Chinese forces. The days blurred into a nightmare of constant skirmishes, desperate retreats, and counterattacks that bled both sides dry. Pinned down on a snow-covered ridge, the Marines were taking heavy casualties, The air was thick with the crack of rifle fire, the explosive thud of mortars, and the chilling screams of the wounded. James moved with a practiced, almost preternatural calm through the chaos, his medical bag a beacon of hope in the swirling blizzard of war. He crawled from foxhole to foxhole, administering aid under a hail of bullets that truly did not discriminate. Black, white, Hispanic, Native American, every Marine bled the same red, visceral proof that their shared humanity transcended the artificial divisions of race. He worked tirelessly, his hands numb with cold but steady. He knelt beside Private Miller, a fresh-faced recruit from Texas who had openly scoffed at coloreds during their training, now clutching his gut, his eyes wide with pain and terror. James ignored the past slights, focusing solely on the gaping wound, stemming the flow of blood, his voice a soothing balm amidst the cacophony of war. "Hold tight, son. You're gonna make it," he murmured, his breath fogging in the frigid air. Minutes later, he was tending to Sergeant Daniels, a seasoned veteran, whose arm had been mangled by shrapnel. Daniels, a man who had once refused to share a mess tent table with James, now gripped James's shoulder with his good hand, a silent plea for help that needed no words. In the crucible of combat, the arbitrary distinctions of race melted away, replaced by the universal language of suffering and the desperate need for survival. James saw it clearly. Here, in this frozen, bloody landscape, every man was simply a Marine, fighting for his life, dependent on the man next to him, regardless of color. But as the battle raged into its second day, a new, chilling reality began to emerge. The casualty reports flooding into the makeshift aid station were horrific, and the medical supplies, once seemingly endless, were dwindling at an alarming rate. Plasma, the precious liquid used to combat shock and replenish lost blood, was critically low. Bandages were scarce, morphine vials few. The field hospital, miles away over impassable terrain, was unreachable. With each passing hour, more Marines were bleeding out, their life force draining into the frozen earth. James watched, his heart a leaden weight in his chest, as corpsmen wrestled with the agonizing choice of who to save, who to give the last dose of plasma to. The decision was agonizing, but it was a decision that James refused to make. He saw Private Jones, a young man from Nebraska, his leg blown off, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his skin ashen. Jones was in dire need of a transfusion, but there was no plasma left. Another Marine, Corporal Lee, lay unconscious, a chest wound steadily pumping blood into his uniform. Without immediate blood replacement, both would die. Desperation gnawed at James, a cold, sharp blade. He had trained for this, had dreamed of saving lives, but now he was helpless, his skills rendered useless by the simple lack of supplies. The thought was unbearable. He remembered his pre-med studies, the basic principles of blood types, the sheer volume of blood in the human body. He had seen direct transfusions in textbooks, rudimentary and risky, but a desperate measure. What if he could find a way, any way, to get blood into these dying men? The idea, wild and untested in such conditions, began to take root in his mind, spurred by the raw, agonizing desperation of the battlefield. He knew he had to try. Failure meant certain death for these men. Success, though unimaginable, was the only option. If this story of courage moves you, hit that like button to honor the unsung heroes who changed history. The decision was made, not with fanfare, but with the quiet resolve of a man staring death in the face and refusing to blink. Plasma was gone. Whole blood supplies were exhausted. The bitter cold only exacerbated the shock in the wounded, making every lost drop of blood a march closer to the grave. Private Jones, his eyes now glazed and unfocused, was fading fast. Corporal Lee's breathing had become shallow, irregular. James knew he had precious little time. His mind raced, a whirlwind of anatomical diagrams, medical principles, and the improvisation lessons learned during his segregated training. He remembered a dusty old pre-med textbook discussing early crude methods of direct blood transfusion, arm to arm using simple tubing. It was dangerous, fraught with risk, but it was all he had. The question was, how to make it happen here, in this frozen, blood-soaked hell. He scanned the immediate vicinity of the aid station, his gaze alight with desperate ingenuity. What could he use? His eyes landed on the discarded tubing from a field radio's antenna array, a flexible, narrow rubber line. Not ideal for medical use, certainly, but it was clean, relatively pliable. For needles, he improvised. He remembered an engineer's kit had thin metal rods. Perhaps they could be sharpened and sterilized. Sterilization was key. He called out to another corpsman, "Get me the boiling water from the coffee pot, and every drop of alcohol you can find." With meticulous care, he sharpened the ends of two small metal rods, then submerged them in the boiling water, letting them sterilize as thoroughly as possible. He doused the radio tubing with alcohol, hoping against hope. His first attempt was on Private Jones. He needed a donor. He quickly identified a volunteer, a strapping Marine named O'Malley, who despite his injuries insisted on helping. James quickly checked their blood types using the rudimentary field kits they had. O'Malley was a universal donor.
He explained the risks to both men, his voice calm, steady, despite the tremor in his hands. He made a small incision in O'Malley's arm, carefully inserting one of the improvised needles into a prominent vein. Then, with a prayer on his lips, he did the same for Jones. The radio tubing, now connected to both, began its silent, miraculous work. A thin, crimson stream flowed from O'Malley's vein, through the makeshift tubing, and into Jones's arm. Minutes stretched into an eternity. James watched, his breath held tight in his chest, for any sign of adverse reaction, any flicker of hope. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, color began to return to Jones's ashen face. His breathing deepened, becoming more regular. A weak groan escaped his lips, and his eyes fluttered open, still dazed, but now present. James felt a surge of adrenaline, a profound sense of triumph. It had worked. He had cheated death. Word spread through the unit like wildfire. A black corpsman, Doc Richardson, had figured out a way to give blood directly from one Marine to another. More wounded arrived, some near death from blood loss, and James repeated the procedure, each time refining his technique, his movements growing more confident. He used the tubing from a broken field stove for another line, sterilized it, and found other willing donors. Officers, initially skeptical, began to notice the astonishing survival rates coming from Richardson's aid station. Men who by all accounts should have been dead were clinging to life, stabilized enough to be moved once the fighting eased. It wasn't long before other corpsmen, overwhelmed and desperate, sought out James. He didn't hesitate. Under the flickering light of a single lantern, with the sounds of battle still echoing around them, he quickly demonstrated his improvised technique. He taught them how to identify prominent veins, how to carefully insert the improvised needles, how to monitor for reactions, and the critical importance of donor blood typing. He shared his innovation freely, understanding that in this hell, knowledge shared was lives saved. The blood, once a symbol of racial division, had become, in James Richardson's hands, a literal lifeline, uniting men in their shared struggle for survival. He had not just innovated a medical procedure, he had, in that desperate frozen landscape, forged a new path for saving lives, born not of luxury, but of absolute necessity, and an unyielding will to heal. Subscribe to hear more untold stories of battlefield innovation and heroism. As the battle for the chosen reservoir finally receded into a grueling, bloody stalemate, the scale of the human cost became tragically clear. Yet, amidst the grim accounting, an unexpected anomaly emerged from the 1st Marine Division's medical reports. The survival rate for critical casualties suffering from severe blood loss in certain aid stations was remarkably higher than anticipated. When medical officers began to investigate, the name Corporal James "Doc" Richardson kept appearing. His improvised direct blood transfusion technique, born of desperation and ingenuity, had saved scores of lives. Detailed reports, compiled by the medical officers who had witnessed his work, began to climb the chain of command. They meticulously documented the materials used, the radio tubing, the sharpened metal rods, and the surprisingly high success rate under conditions that should have ensured fatality. The military medical corps, often slow to adopt new methods, could not ignore the irrefutable evidence. Richardson's technique, initially a crude battlefield improvisation, was brought back from the front lines, studied and refined. Engineers developed sterile, pre-packaged kits containing appropriate tubing and needles. Medical researchers delved into the intricacies of direct donor-to-recipient transfusions, understanding the risks but also the immense life-saving potential when plasma was unavailable. What had been a desperate measure for one corpsman became a formalized emergency procedure, eventually integrated into military medical training across all branches. The Richardson method, as some unofficially called it, became a standard part of extreme battlefield triage, a testament to the fact that innovation could arise from the most unlikely of places. For his extraordinary actions at Chosin, Corporal James Richardson was awarded the Navy Cross, a testament to his outstanding courage, resourcefulness, and unwavering dedication to duty. The ceremony was understated, but the commendation spoke volumes of his selfless heroism. Yet for James, the greatest reward wasn't the medal, but the faces of the Marines he had pulled back from the brink, the letters he received from grateful families, and the knowledge that he had fulfilled his deepest calling. The crisis of war, particularly in the unforgiving crucible of Chosin, had for a time forced a profound shift in perspective. In the face of shared peril, racial prejudice had to yield to shared humanity. Officers and enlisted men who might have once looked down on a black corpsman now owed their lives, or the lives of their comrades, to his ingenuity and courage. It was a poignant, if temporary, lesson in equality, a brutal realization that true merit and capability mattered more than the color of one's skin when survival hung in the balance. After the Korean War, James Richardson continued his service in military medicine. His experience at Chosin had solidified his resolve to pursue advanced medical training. He went on to become a highly respected physician, dedicating his life to serving others, often in underserved communities, carrying the lessons of the battlefield into every interaction. His innovation, born in blood and snow, ultimately saved hundreds if not thousands of lives over the decades, shaping military medical protocols for future conflicts. It underscored the power of an individual to change the course of history, not with a weapon, but with intellect, compassion, and an unyielding will to heal. James Richardson's story is a powerful reminder that courage is not just about facing the enemy, but also about overcoming internal battles, challenging systemic injustice, and innovating under the most dire circumstances. It is a testament to the indomitable human spirit, proving that dignity can be found and asserted even in the most dehumanizing environments, and that an idea, born of necessity and nurtured by compassion, can echo through time, saving lives long after the last bullet has been fired. His legacy is not just in the medical texts, but in the countless lives that continued because of his incredible courage and innovation. Leave a comment below. Did you know about this incredible story? What other unsung heroes should we cover?